Traffic laws are weird. There have been countless attempts at regulating the movement of these metal beasts on the road. From the first car that could move at an incredible 16 kilometers an hour to the slightly faster supercars we have today. Some of these laws were brilliant, genius, first-place contenders, but others will be taking home a participation trophy. So, let's run through some of the laws we've had through the years, both in South Africa and the rest of the world. We'll take a look at how we got them and ask important questions like, how bad is jaywalking really? Or should we drive on the left or the right side of the road? And once we're done, we'll look at which laws need to go, which laws need to change, and which laws we can add. Let's get to it. One of the best examples of good and effective lawmaking was the mandating of seatbelts. The 3-point seatbelt was patented in 1955, but it wouldn't be until 1970 when Victoria, Australia, would be the first part of the world to make wearing them compulsory. Today, wearing a seatbelt while driving is a requirement in South Africa, as it is in most of the world, and we've all been better off because of that fact. It is estimated that, in the United States alone, an approximate 370,000 people have been saved by seatbelts over the last 50 years, and that if more people wore seatbelts, an additional 2,500 people could have been saved just in 2017. However, there are many other safety features which are not requirements in South Africa. Features such as ABS, electronic stability control, or even airbags. Although the AA is currently pushing the South African government to mandate all of these features in all vehicles, which seems like a step in the right direction. We'll have to wait and see what happens. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we have bad lawmaking. I mean really bad. Offensively bad. There are so many different instances of terrible road legislation in the past, but I feel like sharing my favorite one with you. The Farmers Anti-Automobile Association of Pennsylvania. Back around the turn of the 20th century, cars were becoming more and more commonplace as they began the decades-long process of gradually phasing out horse-driven carriages. For some people, this was a welcome change. It meant that streets were generally cleaner and smelled better due to a distinct decline in horse manure, which was a genuine problem, by the way. During the Great Horse Manure Crisis of 1894, which affected both America and England, New York City alone produced an estimated 2.5 million pounds of horse manure a day. The advent of cars also meant that busy city streets were quieter, as the sound of horse hooves on cobblestone was said to be deafening, to the point where having a conversation was impossible. But some people wanted nothing to do with these newfangled automobiles, which brings me neatly on to the Farmers Anti-Automobile Association of Pennsylvania, an organization created out of fear
for what kind of terror these cars might bring into the world.
An organization that lobbied the state government to implement some interesting legislation that automobile drivers would have to abide by. These laws include: 1. Automobiles traveling on country roads at night must send up a rocket every mile, then wait 10 minutes for the road to clear. The driver may then proceed, with caution, blowing his horn and shooting off Roman candles as before. 2. If the driver of an automobile sees a team of horses approaching, he is to stop, pulling over to one side of the road, and cover his machine with a blanket or dust cover which is painted or colored to blend in with the scenery, and thus render the machine less noticeable. And 3. In the case where a horse is unwilling to pass an automobile on the road, the driver of the car must take the machine apart as rapidly as possible and conceal the parts in the bushes. So how about South Africa's traffic history? Well, unfortunately, a lot of our traffic history isn't as well documented or easily accessible as in other parts of the world. But I can give you a brief rundown of how our roads have changed through the years. The first car in South Africa was a Benz Voiturette imported from Germany in 1896, but cars wouldn't gain any kind of popularity until much, much later. Most of our current road network has only been planned and developed over the course of the last 80 years, give or take, but there doesn't seem to be a clear record on when and where our first paved road was built. I found conflicting sources on when our first traffic light was installed. Some said 1927, others said 1929, but they all seem to agree that it was somewhere in the late 1920s and that it was installed in Johannesburg. Before the 20th century, the various states and settlements that made up the land that we now call the Republic of South Africa had their own laws for railways and streets, but we would ultimately fall under British law when our country was formed under British rule in 1910. These laws would set the standard that our current laws were developed from. Now, in regards to our speed limits through the years. Before 1971, speed limits in South Africa were measured in miles rather than kilometers an hour. At the time of the switch, speed limits on urban roads were 35 miles per hour, or about 56.3 kilometers an hour, and the rural limit was 70 miles per hour, or about 112.7 kilometers an hour. When the transition to the metric system was made, the limits were updated to 60 kilometers an hour and 120 kilometers an hour. Then, in 1973, urban speed limits were reduced to 50 kilometers an hour, and rural speed limits were reduced to 80 kilometers an hour, in an effort to cope with fuel shortages resulting from oil embargoes placed against South Africa during apartheid. In 1974, the urban speed limit was once again raised to 60 kilometers an hour, where it has stayed ever since. And rural speed limits would gradually be raised and changed to the point where today they typically vary from 80 to 120 kilometers an hour. So in the interest of safety, left-hand drive or right-hand drive? Which one is better? There was one study released in 2021 that analyzed 4 years of data from 54 African nations with the goal of determining which road convention should be applied in developing African countries. The study showed that those countries in the dataset that implemented left-hand traffic generally had far fewer casualties than those that drove on the right. However, this analysis is not perfect, and the study itself states that, ideally, we would want to have a larger time series dataset for road fatalities in Africa. And even if there was enough data, this would still only prove correlation rather than causation. See, most other studies seem to show that the rate of fatal car accidents has very little to do with what side of the road the cars are driving on. One fact that seems to be less contested is that, regardless of which convention is used by the country you reside in, it is much safer for you to drive if you are driving in a car that was actually made to be on that side of the road. A different study released in 2017 analyzed the dangerous effect of blind spots present in right-hand drive vehicles driving on the roads of European countries that implemented right-hand traffic. This study also focused on data from Sweden during a time when many residents owned cars that were made to drive on the right, even though the country itself used left-hand traffic up until 1967. The study states that, and quote, "Results show that right-hand traffic decreased road fatality, injury, and accident risk in Sweden by approximately 30%. An earlier switch would have saved more than 4,000 lives between 1953 and 1966. So I guess the answer is simple. If you want to stay safe, just make sure you're in the right. Or the left, depending on which way the other cars are going. In South Africa, cars can legally be imported from countries that use right-hand traffic, but those cars cannot be registered or driven on South African roads. This is not the case for some countries such as Germany, France, and Spain, where wrong-hand driving is allowed. So we might actually have a one-up on these guys. Good job, South Africa. So, there isn't a lot of conclusive research on what the perfect speed limit is. Studies do show that when people drive slower, they tend to cause fewer fatal accidents. Obviously. However, this still doesn't answer whether or not it is a good idea to change the legal speed limit. See, the effectiveness of a speed limit, and the changing thereof, depends greatly on other factors as well, such as general road quality, or how well traffic laws are actually enforced, meaning that determining the perfect speed limit for South Africa might be a lot harder than you would think. One report released in the year 2000 suggested that we should return to the 90 km/h speed limit, but honestly, I don't think that's gonna go down very well with our citizens. I have a feeling that this is going to be a controversial one, but there is evidence to suggest that, with proper enforcement, changing jaywalking laws so that pedestrians have right-of-way over cars, not just for marked crossings but for regular city motorways as well, you will then reduce pedestrian casualties. Many countries don't criminalize jaywalking. Countries such as Norway, the UK, the Netherlands, and even some parts of the US such as Virginia, where jaywalking was made legal in 2021. These countries, along with a few select studies, seem to be proof that such a quote-unquote backward system can work. But if you're looking for a definitive answer on what the perfect road laws are, I unfortunately cannot help you, because while evidence is compelling, once again, there is nothing conclusive yet. So if there is evidence to suggest that laws against jaywalking should at the very least be more lax, why do we even have these laws in the first place? See, today jaywalking refers to someone walking across the road illegally or without regard for oncoming traffic, but this is actually more modern of a concept than you might realize. The term itself only started gaining popularity about 100 years ago. You might be wondering, where did the concept of jaywalking even come from? Well, allow me to explain. Back in 1920s America, streets were considered to be essentially public spaces, and pedestrians would typically roam around freely. But as cars started becoming more and more popular, and crucially started moving faster and faster, this became more and more dangerous until the inevitable happened. People started getting run over. This was a crucial time for the car industry. If they didn't react quickly, the reputation of the automobile would be ripped to shreds. So they did the logical thing. They started lobbying, manipulated newspaper reports, and took pretty much every conceivable measure to make sure that the public believed that the accidents were the fault of the pedestrians rather than the drivers and the vehicles that they used. Pedestrians who were victims in these early motor accidents were often dubbed as jaywalkers. This is widely regarded as where the term jaywalker came from. Jay, an insult at the time, refers to someone that is unsophisticated or not well versed with city life, implying that if you got hit by a car, it was because you were unskilled and clueless. So, during a time when cars were moving at unprecedented speeds and pedestrians were tragically dying in motor accidents left and right, bystanders would basically respond with, many cities in America would criminalize jaywalking as a finable offense, and the rest of the world would follow suit. There is a lot that we can argue needs to be changed, from our laws on jaywalking to our speed limits, not to mention that our cars aren't even required to have airbags. But perhaps the greatest change that we can make is to do more research. One of the most worrying and quite frankly depressing things that I discovered when researching this video was how few conclusive studies have been done, and how bad we still are at answering simple questions. Not to sell the scientific community short, there is a lot of great work that has been done, but there is still oh so much left to do. So if there is one thing that I can recommend, it is that we fund and conduct more studies that determine the safety and effectiveness of our infrastructure, our laws, and the way we enforce those laws. We must act with precision and speed. There are lives at stake. Get wrecked, noob!